I will kill her children with death. And all the churches shall know that I am he who searches the kidneys and hearts. And I will give to each one of you according to your works. Now pay close attention here. This is a paraphrase from Jeremiah 17:10 that we already looked at, which proves that the author of Revelation believed the same thing the author of Jeremiah did. Because it's not a quote, it's a paraphrase. The heart and the kidneys were centers of thinking in the human body. He doesn't reword it to say searches the motives or thoughts or intentions or minds. He leaves it just as it was, hearts and kidneys. The amazing thing is that not one translation renders the Hebrew and Greek words for kidneys in these verses as kidneys. Not once, even though the words in question mean kidneys. The KJV, Young's literal translation, and Darby, as well as the WEB, all render the Hebrew word for kidney as reins. This is as close as you'll get to the true meaning, and only by taking the time to look under the hood would you see that the modern translations have deliberately avoided translating it as kidneys. I wonder why. Because it would sound silly by our modern standards. Yet, translating the Greek word for heart, cardia, as heart, well, that's different. We all know it's just a figure of speech for the innermost part of human beings. Strangely, the KJV translators knew the word for kidney and used it in all of the verses about burnt offerings and animal sacrifices. Now, why would the KJV render this Hebrew word for kidney as reins instead of kidney, as they did in the other verses? Well, it's obvious. The verses talking about sacrificial instructions, well, we can call that kidneys because it isn't embarrassing to hear. But in the verses talking about searching the heart and kidneys, we've got to translate that as reins and hope nobody notices. Because at the end of the 16th century, it was becoming clear that the heart, and certainly the kidneys, were not where human emotions and thoughts and sensations were processed. So they used a word that wouldn't sound quite as obvious and silly, even by 16th century standards. So, what does the word reins mean? Most other translations translate kilya, the word meaning kidney, as mind, or some even as heart, unless the verse also mentions heart in it. If you look up the word on dictionary.com, the very first definition is the kidneys. What a shocker. Let's see what happens when we type the English word kidneys into Google Translate using Latin as our target language. Well, there's a surprise. Now let's have a look at the definition of the Hebrew word kilya, Strong's Hebrew 3629, and the very first definition of the word is kidneys. Strong's also lists an alternative definition, the seat of emotion and affection. And it says that the first definition is literal, the physical organ, but when it speaks in terms of emotions and affection, well, that's figurative. But what Strong's doesn't understand, like my subscribers now do, is that this is not true. There was no figure of speech about the kidneys back then. It was all a literal belief. So there's no debate whatsoever that kilya and reins both mean kidneys, but the KJV didn't feel comfortable translating every instance of kilya as kidneys, so they used a more obscure word that wouldn't cause so much questioning and possibly giggling, reins. This is where we get our modern word renal, as in renal failure, which means kidney failure. Let's go back and look at that one lone instance of kidneys in the New Testament. Let's have a look at the actual Greek word written by the author of Revelation. The Greek word is nephros. It means kidney. It's where we get the words nephrology, nephritis, and so on. Look at the word epinephrine. It is the less common name of the hormone secreted by the adrenal glands. This comes from the Greek words epi, meaning upon, nephros, meaning kidney, and ine, the suffix denoting the chemical nature of the word. This same chemical, epinephrine, has a more commonly known Latin version, adrenaline, ad, meaning to or on, renal, meaning kidney, and ine again, the suffix denoting that this word represents a chemical. Notice the root words again, Greek nephros and Latin ren or reins. What this shows to me is that the author of Revelation understood that the Old Testament references to kidneys were not figurative ways of saying inmost being, but were in fact a literal reference to the kidneys. He apparently also believed, as most people did back then, that the kidneys were, along with the heart, the home of thoughts and memories and emotions, and so on. To translate these as anything but kidneys is to mask the true meaning of these passages. The authors could have written the verses in 100 other ways to mean that God searches the core, the innermost parts, the soul, the essence of a person, their mind. But instead, they actually wrote heart and kidneys because that was their literal belief. The heart and kidneys were the storehouses of what made humans tick back then, our brains, our minds. And now we know why the Egyptians often left both the heart and the kidneys inside of mummies instead of drying them out with the rest of the organs. Now we also know why the figures of speech involving kidneys died off completely. First, no Bibles ever translated them into the English word kidneys. And second, the antiquated word reins was easily overshadowed by the overwhelming use of the word heart in the Bible. 1,038 hearts to 15 kidneys. No contest. It's tragic, really, when you think about it, because I think "I love you with all my kidneys" has a nice ring to it, don't you? And thus, the literal beliefs of old, when finally discovered to be false, became figures of speech, symbols, poetic pinch hitters. But in those brutal ancient days of desert and sun, pyramids and plagues, human sacrifices, and seemingly constant bloodshed and war, the God of the Israelites searched the hearts and kidneys of mankind.